The soup was warm, still steaming, still untouched. A single candle flickered on a store-bought cupcake, slightly tilted in the saucer I once used for Sunday jam. No music. No footsteps. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the sink. I waited longer than I should have. The phone didn't ring. No knock at the door. Not even a happy birthday by text. Kelly had left a note. Busy with Evan's company dinner. There's food in the fridge. Evan had left a voice message. Hey Mom, we might be late. Just eat without us. Okay. So I did. At 6:14 p.m. I pulled my chair in. The cushion sighed beneath me like it too remembered what this day used to feel like. I took a bite of soup. It needed more salt. But I didn't get up. The silence was too thick to move through. I just sat. And chewed. Across from me, 2 empty chairs. One still had a sweater slung over the back. Kelly's perfume clung to it, something sharp and floral. It stung my nose. I stared at the place where Evan used to sit. Where he once told me at age 7 birthday soup is my favorite mama. I smiled at the memory. Then blinked and it was gone. No balloons. No card. Not even a joke about getting older. Just me. And a candle. That finally gave up and died. I rinsed the bowl gently. Dried it with the towel his father used to hang on the oven handle, folded it in half. Hung it back. Then I walked down the hall. Opened the drawer where we kept the tax files. And pulled out the original deed to the house. My name was still there. Clear. Unmoved. Unshared. The silence in the kitchen behind me felt less like peace and more like warning. I turned to face the room one last time. The chairs. The cupcake. The flickering, half-hearted light. And I whispered not to anyone in particular, but to the walls that had heard everything. Maybe next year someone else will be eating alone. I was not supposed to live with them. Not at first. It started with Evan's voice shaky on the other end of the phone. Mom. We're kind of stuck. They were newly married. Kelly had just quit her job to freelance full-time. Evan had taken out a loan, too many promises, not enough cushion. They needed help. Not with money exactly. But with everything. Just for a little while, he said. A few months, maybe. You'd have your own space. I remember looking out my window that morning. Snow falling softly onto my rose beds. The roof of my old home sagging in places I could no longer fix. The walls still held his laughter. My husband's. Even after 10 years. But the heater wheezed like a tired man. And the stair rail wobbled when I leaned on it. Maybe it was time. Maybe being near Evan would be good. For both of us. So I sold the house. I gave half the proceeds to Evan. He was drowning in credit card debt and overdue medical bills. The rest went into buying the new place. Bigger, newer, safer. He insisted on putting it in my name. Just until we get sorted, he said. But I knew what that meant. I nodded anyway. I moved in one Saturday in March. Kelly was out on a shoot, so it was just Evan and me unloading boxes and folding blankets. He smiled like he used to, boyish, unsure. You okay, Mom? I was. At least for that moment. They gave me the downstairs room. Big windows. A soft chair, a small fridge just for me. You can cook whenever you want, Kelly had said. Her voice sounded sweet that day. Like a hostess greeting a guest. She never called me Marilyn. Not Mom. Just her. At first, I pretended not to notice. People have their ways. Not everyone is warm from the start. I busied myself with little things. Fixing the loose curtain rods, arranging spices, making bread that filled the house with cinnamon and clove. But the silence upstairs grew louder. Kelly's laughter never reached the stairwell. Evan's conversations became shorter. Less eye contact. More doors left half closed. One evening, I overheard them in the kitchen. "She's always in the way," Kelly whispered. "Like a couch, you don't know where to put." That night, I didn't sleep much. Just sat by the window watching snow melt off the neighbor's roof. Drop by drop. Some silences are heavier than words. And some words echo longer than screams. The downstairs room became smaller. Not in size, but in how it was spoken about. Kelly started calling it the guest suite. Even when I was sitting in it. "She's in the guest suite," she told the internet technician. "She uses that little kitchenette. We like giving people their space." I wasn't people. I was Evan's mother. But I smiled. Because I had been taught dignity often means swallowing the small insults. I hung my apron on the wall, tucked my spices into a narrow drawer, kept my shoes in a single row near the coat rack. And I tried to be small. The kind of quiet that does not interrupt. At dinner, I brought out roasted vegetables and cornbread. Kelly picked at it. Said she was cutting carbs. Evan said nothing. So I cleared the plates. Washed them slowly. Took note of how the water cooled halfway through. It was early April when I noticed the shift. The way Evan leaned toward her during conversation. How his voice lowered when I entered the room. He had a softness for her. A protective bend. I recognized it used to be mine. One morning, Kelly hosted her book club. I offered to make tea. She waved her hand. "Oh, don't worry, they're not really tea people. Besides, you probably like older blends." I stayed in my room that afternoon. Listened to the thrum of their laughter upstairs. Every burst felt like a reminder I no longer belonged in that kind of noise. Later that week, Evan knocked on my door. Not to chat. Not to ask how I was. "Kelly says she needs more room for her inventory," he said. "She's thinking of converting the downstairs closet. The only closet I had." I looked at him. Waited for a smile. A wink. Some trace of the boy I raised. But there was only silence. I nodded. The next morning, I boxed my coats. Folded my scarves. Labeled each bin with shaky handwriting. I sat on the bed afterwards surrounded by plastic. The scent of lavender dryer sheets floating in the air. There's a kind of loneliness that arrives not with distance, but with closeness unacknowledged. They didn't push me out. They just stopped letting me in. I learned to walk more softly. To close doors gently. To eat before they got home. I told myself I was adjusting. But every night I found myself holding the same photo frame, the one with Evan as a toddler, his cheeks pressed to mine, his arms around my neck. He used to call me his best girl. Now I was barely a shadow in the home I helped him keep. I stopped baking. It wasn't a decision really. Just something that faded. The mixer stayed in its box. My flour went untouched. Even the cinnamon smelled tired. One afternoon I reached for my recipe book, the one with butter stains and torn corners. But it wasn't where I left it. I searched every drawer. Every shelf. Finally, found it tucked behind the rice cooker under a bag of protein powder Kelly bought but never opened. I wiped the cover gently. Ran my fingers along the note inside. "Happy 40th Marilyn. Bake the world softer." His handwriting. My husband's. Still slanted, still blue. I sat down. Opened to the page for lemon pound cake. Stared at it until the words blurred. Then closed it again. No one had asked for cake in months. I started walking in the evenings. Around the block. Past the house with the tall pine, the cracked sidewalk near the mailbox. Sometimes I passed by families in their kitchens. The smell of soup drifting through screen doors. The kind of warmth that used to follow me home. Now it belonged to others. One night, as I approached our driveway, I heard laughter inside. Music. Wine glasses clinking. They hadn't told me about guests. Again. I paused at the door. Listened. Kelly was retelling a story. Something about how her mother never let herself get old. She still throws birthday parties, she said, giggling into a glass. The room erupted with delight. I walked quietly around the back, entered through the laundry room, slipped into my own space. No one noticed. The heater clicked on loud metallic. The kind of sound you learn to live with when your complaints no longer echo. I reheated soup. Saturday on the edge of my bed. Ate in silence. Again. The next morning Kelly knocked on my door. Not to say sorry. Not to ask if I wanted coffee. "We need the pantry space," she said. "Would you mind moving your dry goods to your fridge cabinet? It's just more convenient." I nodded, because by then I had forgotten what no felt like. That afternoon I opened the drawer beneath my bed, pulled out the envelope. The house deed. Still sealed. Still mine. I stared at my name. It looked steady. Unmoved. Unlike me. I placed the envelope flat on the desk. Smoothed the corners. Turned off the lamp. Outside the laughter had returned. But I no longer strained to hear it. Something inside me had begun to grow quiet in a different way. Not the silence of being left out. The silence of starting to let go. It began with the bookshelf. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find my books gone. The row of old cookbooks. My poetry collections. Even the gardening guides I never really used. In their place, succulent pots and framed quotes in pastel fonts. Manifest joy, one read in pink looping script. I blinked. Checked the hallway. Opened the hall closet. There they were. Stacked on the floor, spines bent, pages curling from dampness. I didn't say anything. Just carried my recipe books downstairs. Set them on the window ledge near the heater. A few days later, my tea kettle vanished. The blue one with the chipped handle. I found it in a donation box by the garage door. When I asked, Kelly laughed. "Oh, I thought it was for Goodwill. We're decluttering. Minimalism, you know." Evan did not look up from his phone. He never did anymore. I started keeping my things in bins. Labeled them in black marker. Soup pots. Linens. Holiday decor. I stored them under the bed beside the rolling heater that always sputtered at night. The home upstairs grew brighter, louder, Kelly's voice echoing down the stairwell as she filmed makeup tutorials and recorded podcast intros from the master bedroom. She never asked me to keep quiet. She just played her ring light videos while my door stayed shut. At dinner, I was no longer asked to join. They ordered takeout. Thai food. Vegan bowls. Things I didn't recognize. Sometimes, Evan would knock and leave a container by my door. Other times, he forgot. One night I made stew. Enough for 3. I laid out the table. Folded napkins. Lit a candle. No one came down. I waited 30 minutes. Then spooned the stew into containers, placed them in the fridge, and ate alone. The next day, Kelly told me it was a sweet gesture, but spontaneous meals aren't really our vibe. Hour. Like I was not part of the hour. I nodded. Again. In the weeks that followed, my photo disappeared from the hallway. The one of Evan at his graduation. Me beside him, holding his diploma in one hand and a bouquet in the other. I found it later in the downstairs storage closet. Face down. Under a pile of reusable grocery bags. I sat beside it on the cold floor for a long time. Listening to the sound of a house that no longer made space for my name. Sunday mornings used to be mine. Back in my own home, I'd rise before the sun cracked the kitchen window and let cinnamon rolls scent the whole block. Here I learned to wait. To stay quiet until the floorboards upstairs stopped creaking. To time my kettle between podcast recordings. To swallow the urge to hum old hymns as I stirred my oatmeal. One Sunday, I stepped out at 7 in the morning just to stretch, feel the dew on my ankles. Kelly opened the door in her robe, her face stiff, eyes puffy from sleep. "Oh," she said, clearly startled. "We're filming today. Maybe skip the porch this morning." I nodded, closed the door behind me. The kettle inside had already cooled. I spent that morning folding towels and rearranging cans in my cabinet, trying not to feel like a stranger in slippers treading too loudly through someone else's dream. That afternoon, Evan knocked on my door. He smiled softly, but it did not reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom. Kelly and I have been thinking maybe we should draw some clearer lines. You know, just so everyone feels balanced." He tilted my head. "Linus?" "Yeah. Like boundaries. Maybe mealtimes are separate. And the laundry schedule, Kelly's working on a calendar." He scratched his neck. Would not look directly at me. She needs to feel like this is her home too." I wanted to laugh, but my throat felt full. Instead, I said the only thing I could. "Of course." The next week, a whiteboard appeared in the hallway, with time blocks, names in bold marker. Kitchen use Marilyn from 5 to 6 in the evening. Living room Evan and Kelly Friday nights only. Laundry Kelly on Sundays. Marilyn on Mondays. I stared at it for a long time. Like someone reading a schedule at a hostel. Not a home. I took a pen. Wrote in the corner, small and crooked window seat always mine. It was gone the next morning. Wiped clean. Replaced with a note. "Let's keep things neutral. Thanks." Signed with a smiley face. I started sleeping with the door locked. Not because I felt unsafe, but because I needed at least one thing to be mine on purpose. That lock clicked like a whisper saying, "You're still here." Even if they don't see it. It was near the end of May when my chair disappeared. The soft blue one. Stuffed with cotton and memory. The one I brought from my old house. It used to sit by the living room window, angled just right to catch the afternoon light on my knees. I came upstairs one Thursday to find a tall fiddle leaf fig in its place. My chair gone. I stood there for a moment like someone who'd arrived at the wrong house. Except it was still my name on the deed. Kelly noticed. "Oh yeah," she said, rearranging throw pillows. "We're trying a more minimalist layout. Less clutter." Clutter. That chair held the weight of 3 decades. Of stories, of silence, of prayers whispered into the arms of dawn. I didn't ask where she put it. I knew better by then. I just turned, walked back down the stairs and made tea in my little pot with the chipped spout. That night I dreamed of my old living room. The oak floors. The drafty window that never quite sealed shut. The sound of birds rustling in the gutters. In the dream, no one moved anything. The next week, they hosted a barbecue. Invited coworkers. Friends from Kelly's yoga studio. No one told me. I heard them laughing through the vents. Heard the grill lid slam. Music. Plastic cups clinking. At one point, someone opened the downstairs door by mistake. "Oh, sorry," a man said, glancing at me like he had stumbled into a storage room. I smiled. Then closed the door. 2 hours later, a half-eaten burger and cold corn were left outside my room on a paper plate. Not a word. Not a note. Just food, like something left for a tenant or a stray. I stood over it for a long time. Then threw it away. I made toast instead. Saturday on the edge of my bed. Ate in the dark. And told myself this isn't permanent. It's just transition. But even lies whispered softly can bruise you if you say them enough. The next morning I pulled the recipe book from under the bed. Dusted off the spine, turned to a blank page. Then wrote one sentence in ink. Some exits are quiet. But they still count as leaving. The envelope came on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Evan, but arrived in my name. A notice from the county about property taxes. I had seen them before. Each year, like clockwork. Folded in thirds, printed in pale ink. But this time, someone had scrawled in red across the corner. Please update primary contact address. Return requested. I blinked. Turned it over. Back again. Then walked up the stairs. Evan was in the kitchen eating yogurt straight from the container. He looked surprised to see the letter in my hand. I thought I handled that, he mumbled. Told them to send things here. I raised an eyebrow. This is here. He laughed awkwardly. No, I mean to me. Like officially. I opened the letter, placed it gently on the counter. You still want me as owner? That's what we agreed. He shrugged. Yeah, of course, just trying to make things easier, more streamlined. Kelly walked in carrying a box of candles, her phone wedged between shoulder and ear. She glanced at the letter, then at me, then turned away. I thought you said you filed the new deed, she whispered loud enough for both of us to hear. Evan froze. Then cleared his throat. It's fine. We'll talk later. Later came that night. He knocked, held a manila folder and a pen. Just want to show you something, nothing urgent, just options. I opened the folder. Inside was a pre-filled transfer form. Deed adjustment. Grantee change. His name. Kelly's name. My name moved to the corner as previous owner. The house I paid for. Saved for. Sold my own home to secure. Kelly's been talking to a friend, he said, about refinancing, future planning, estate stuff. He was sweating even though the room was cool. You'd still live here, obviously. We'd just simplify things. I looked at the page. My name was still there, but quieter, smaller, grayed out like a placeholder, someone meant to erase once they felt brave enough. I closed the folder slowly, carefully, and handed it back. Not today. He didn't argue. He just stood there like a boy who'd been told no for the first time and didn't know where to put his hands. 2 days later, the folder appeared again. This time on the kitchen table next to a mug of tea I did not make. The pen rested on top like it was waiting, like it belonged there, like I had already agreed. Kelly walked in barefoot, smiling too much. Hey Marilyn, hope you do not mind, I printed a cleaner copy. No rush, just figured it might be easier this way. Easier. That word again. She reached for a spoon, stirred her own cup, without asking if I wanted one. It is just housekeeping, really. Evan and I talked to a guy who said dual ownership is confusing for taxes and emergencies and, you know, insurance. She kept her voice light like she was explaining a weather report. We would just feel more secure, knowing things are streamlined. That word again. I stared at her, past her mascara, past the soft sweater, past the practiced calm, into the part of her that had already decided I was in the way. I did not touch the folder. That night I took the deed from my drawer, the real one, creased and old, with my husband's signature at the bottom. I held it under the light, traced my name with my thumb. I still remembered the day I signed it. Evan was 29, fresh out of a job, eyes dull with shame. I had hugged him so tightly he dropped the pen. Now he wanted me to vanish as cleanly as he had once asked me to save him. The next morning, I stood at the mailbox, letter in hand, not the form, not the transfer. My own letter. Addressed to the county office. Requesting updated title documents, a new certified copy, and my name only. I wanted proof. I wanted something recent, something fresh, something they could not claim was an oversight. Kelly passed behind me wearing sunglasses, headed to her car. She did not say good morning. She never did anymore. Inside, I poured myself a cup of coffee, watched the steam rise until it disappeared. I placed the cup down and said aloud to no one but maybe to the walls. They will not take what I built and tell me it was a gift. It was a Friday when Evan brought it up again. Dinner had ended, or what passed for dinner these days. They ate at the counter on separate stools, scrolling their phones, barely speaking. I sat at the table with leftover stew and a cloth napkin folded just so. He lingered after she went upstairs. Pulled out the chair across from me. Mom, I know this is uncomfortable, but we really need to talk about the house. I kept my spoon in the bowl. He hesitated. You have been holding on to everything. Taxes, utilities, repairs. It makes more sense for Kelly and me to handle it now. I looked up. And by handle, you mean own. He blinked. I mean manage. You would still live here, obviously. That word again. Like I should be grateful for the privilege of keeping what was already mine. I set my spoon down. Do you remember the porch light that flickered for weeks? He tilted his head, thrown off. I fixed it, I said quietly. Bought the bulb, climbed the ladder while you were in Austin last fall. I didn't know that, he said. No. You didn't. I stood, took my bowl to the sink, rinsed it under warm water. Behind me, he sighed. It is not personal, Mom. It is just paperwork. I dried the bowl slowly, held it in my hands as if it were made of something ancient. You keep saying that, I replied. But it feels very personal. He left the folder again, this time on my bed. I did not touch it. Instead, I slipped the certified copy of the deed into a new envelope, addressed it to myself, sealed it, and placed it under the mattress. A reminder. A root. One morning, I found Kelly in the hallway holding a tape measure marking the guest room walls. What are you measuring? She looked startled. Oh, nothing. Just thinking of a redesign, maybe a craft area, something productive. I nodded but said nothing. By then I understood. They weren't planning to push me out. They were planning to repurpose me. Like a chair moved to the garage. Like an heirloom without a story attached. But I had my story. And my name. Still etched, still legal, still mine. It was my birthday again. 76. No candles this time. No cupcake. No whispered wish in the dark. I woke up to silence. No footsteps overhead. No knock at the door. The window was gray with early fog. The kind that settles in your lungs and stays. I made tea. Chamomile because it felt softer than anything else I could stomach. I checked my phone. One alert. Spam. The calendar app still read Birthday Marilyn like it was trying to be kind. Around 9 I heard the car pull out. Kelly's voice sharp, laughing as the door slammed behind them. No note. No breakfast tray. Not even the casual forgetfulness of busy people. Just nothing. I sat on the couch, the one pushed into the far corner of the downstairs room. Balanced my tea on a stack of old recipe books. And waited. I told myself maybe Evan had made a plan. Maybe this was just a delay. A surprise. Something thoughtful to cover the hollowness of last year. But afternoon came, then evening. Still nothing. I reheated soup from a batch I made 2 days ago. Ate it slowly between spoonfuls of silence. By 7 I lit the candle myself. The same one I saved from a birthday past. Watched it burn until it sank into itself. Then I cleaned up, washed the bowl, wiped the counter. The house above remained quiet. That night I sat in bed with my old photo album. The one with plastic sleeves and curling corners. Pictures of Evan as a boy. At 5. At 12. At 18. Each one a tiny reminder of how much I had poured into someone who no longer knew how to look back. Near the back I found a photo of me and my husband. We were laughing, half sunk into the grass at a 4th of July picnic. His hand was on mine. Firm. Certain. There was a note on the back, faded but still visible. To the woman who holds everything together. I placed the photo on my lap. Stared at it until the light in the room felt too sharp. Then, without really planning it, I walked to the drawer and pulled out the envelope again. The deed. My name. Still untouched. Still holding. I thought of the form Evan had left on my bed. How its corners curled from being ignored. I placed it beside the album. 2 stories. 2 versions of belonging. And for the first time I allowed myself to feel not just forgotten, but erased. I barely slept. The house was too quiet, but my mind too loud. Every creak in the wall, every shift of air felt like a question I could no longer answer. By morning I had made a decision. Not bold. Not loud. But clear. I folded the photo album, slipped it back under the bed next to the rolling bin of scarves I no longer wore. Then I took the deed, the certified copy, the one I had requested weeks ago, and placed it into my purse. It felt heavier than paper should. At breakfast I stayed in my room. Ate toast slowly. 1 bite every minute. Upstairs, I heard movement, then the front door, then silence again. I stepped out around 10. Took the bus 2 stops, then walked the final blocks to a small law office with dusty blinds and a fading maroon awning. The man behind the desk was young but kind. His name was Mr. Dobbs. I handed him the envelope. He read it. Then looked at me. And waited. "I just want to understand," I said. "If someone pressures me to give this up, but I never agreed, does that hold weight?" He leaned forward. "Are they coercing you?" "No," I replied. "But they are forgetting I exist." He nodded slowly. Then explained everything. My rights. My options. What was written and what could never be unwritten. When I left, the sky was still gray, but the wind had shifted. Something lighter just barely moved through the air. Back home, Evan was in the garage sorting old boxes. He looked up as I passed. Did not ask where I had gone. Did not mention the date. I went straight to my room. Opened the drawer again. And took out the form. That afternoon, I sat by the window for a long time. No book. No sound. Just the rhythm of my own breathing and the faint hum of the neighbor's mower starting again. I looked at the sunlight pooling along the windowsill and thought about how many years I had lived in the background, soft and necessary, like the lining of a coat never seen but expected to be warm. People talk about growing old like it is a season, a shedding, a quieting down. But no one tells you that sometimes it feels more like evaporation. Not gone. Just less seen. Less solid. I tried to remember the last time someone had asked what I was reading, what I was dreaming about, what I missed. I could not. There was a time I would have filled a whole notebook with things I wanted to do, places I wanted to visit, recipes I still hope to try. Now my list was blank. Even my handwriting looked unfamiliar. Shaky. Hesitant. Like it no longer belonged to a woman who once ran a classroom, who once taught children to trace letters with firm lines and bright eyes. I thought of my husband's old joke. "You always carried the map even when we were lost." It made me smile once. Now it just made my hands ache. I sat there until the shadows stretched long and the walls turned gold. No one came downstairs. No one asked where I had been or if I had eaten or how the day had felt. It was as if my absence was easier than my presence. As if my silence was the shape they preferred me in. So I let the silence sit. Let it press against my ribs. Let it name itself. Not loneliness. Not even grief. Just the quiet truth of being no longer counted. The next morning I made tea, but not in the small chipped kettle. I brought out the old blue one, the one Kelly had tried to give away, and I cleaned it, polished it until it caught the sunlight on the spout. It whistled sharper than I remembered. I let it sing. Then I took out a notepad, one I had tucked into the back of a drawer next to expired coupons and a broken tape measure. I wrote 3 words at the top. What I still want. For a moment, the pen hovered. The silence around me thickened. Then slowly I began. Warm light in the kitchen. The sound of bread rising. A window with a chair beside it that no one moves. The list grew. Clumsily but honestly. No revenge. No confrontation. Just restoration. A return to something I almost forgot was allowed choosing. I folded the list, placed it into the recipe book between the lemon cake and the blueberry muffins like a bookmark for a different kind of future. Later that day, I called Sandy. She had been a friend a long time ago, back when we taught second grade together in the classroom, with sticky floors and butterfly posters. We had not spoken in years, but her voice still carried the same calm. "Sandy," I said, "do you know a good realtor?" There was a pause, then a smile in her voice. "For yourself or someone else?" "For myself," I said, and felt the words settle like seeds into soil. We agreed to meet the next day. A small cafe, no rush. No promises. Just curiosity. I hung up and stared at the window. Outside, a single bird had landed on the porch railing. Small gray, a little unsure. But it stayed. And for the first time in a very long time, so did I. Would you have stayed in a house that no longer saw you? Or would you have chosen a different kind of silence? Tell me in the comments below. Your journey matters. The cafe was smaller than I remembered. The awning had faded, but the smell inside was still warm, like cinnamon rolls and dusted cocoa. Sandy was already there, waiting by the window, wearing the same brown coat she used to keep on the back of her classroom chair. When she saw me, she stood, then hesitated, then wrapped her arms around me in a way that said, "I still remember you." We ordered tea. She chose peppermint. I stayed with chamomile. She did not ask why. Now why this? She simply opened her notebook. "So tell me, what are you hoping for?" I paused. Stirred my tea slowly. "Quiet," I said. "But the right kind. Not the kind that makes you feel like furniture in someone else's life." She nodded. Did not interrupt. "I want mornings again," I added. "Not apologies. Just mornings. Sunlight through a clean window. Toast on a plate I picked. Maybe someone saying good morning because they see me, not because they have to." We sat there for a long time, just sipping. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a brochure. Modest homes. One-level cottages. Nothing fancy. But all with space for a rocking chair and a small garden. "You would qualify for a private sale," she said. "Low hassle. No one has to know unless you want them to." I ran my hand across the page. Stopped at a picture of a kitchen with yellow tiles and lace curtains. "Where's this one?" "Just 10 minutes from here. Quiet street. A porch that faces west." I closed the brochure carefully, like it might tear if handled too fast. "I'm not ready," I said. "That's fine," Sandy replied. "But someday you might be." Outside, the wind had picked up, pulling leaves into soft spirals. We stood together under the awning, saying goodbye. "I never thought I'd be here," I whispered. Sandy touched my elbow. "None of us do. But some of us get to choose what happens next." I walked home slowly, the brochure tucked deep inside my coat pocket next to a tissue and 2 peppermint candies I would save for later. And for once, the house did not feel like it was waiting to trap me. It just felt temporary. That evening, I moved the chair. The one tucked into the corner facing the blank wall. I pulled it closer to the window. Let it face west, where the sun had started to lower, slow, golden, almost kind. I sat with the brochure again. Opened it flat. Ran my hand across the porch railings in the photo as if I could already feel their grain. Then I stood, walked to the shelf and pulled down the recipe book. Not to cook, but to reread the list I had written, folded inside like a seed. What I still want. Some things had changed. Others had deepened. I added another line. To leave while I still remember who I am. The next morning, I went through my drawers. I was not packing. Not yet. Just noticing. Noticing how many things were not really mine anymore. Shampoo bottles I never picked. A calendar with someone else's handwriting. Towels I never chose hung on hooks I did not place. I folded what I could. Made small piles. Labeled them quietly in my head. Keep. Give away. Begin again. In the back of my closet, I found a photo pressed between sweaters. Evan at 12, his arms wrapped around my waist, grinning, cake frosting on his cheek. I sat down on the floor. Held it. Felt the edges. Not grief. Not kite. More like a goodbye that does not ask for noise. That night I made soup. Enough for one. I set the table for myself with the cloth napkin and the cracked ceramic bowl. I lit a candle not for celebration but for remembering, and I ate slowly, without apology. Upstairs, I heard their footsteps, their laughter, the quiet murmur of a television show I did not know, but it no longer pierced me. They had built a life around my silence. Now I was learning how to build something within it. Something that did not beg to be seen but refused to be erased. And outside the window, the last light of day settled on the windowsill like a promise that had waited patiently to be kept. On Monday, I made 3 phone calls. Each one short, polite, unremarkable. The first was to Sandy. "I think I am ready to see it," I said. She answered without hesitation. "Tomorrow. Noon." The second was to the bank. Just to check on what remained in the account I had opened years ago, back when I thought I might travel after retirement. There was less than I remembered but more than enough for something small, something mine. The third call was to James Howell. A quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that never hurried. He had helped us once long ago, when my husband passed. "James," I said, "I need to make a decision quietly. Is that something you can help with?" He did not ask for details. He simply said, "Yes, Marilyn. Come by Thursday." I hung up and placed the phone face down. Not from fear. Just habit. I spent the rest of the day in small motion. Folding. Sorting. Breathing. I walked the perimeter of the backyard just once, my hands tucked into the sleeves of my cardigan, my eyes tracing the fence line and the ivy that had started to curl through the slats. It had grown without permission. No one had noticed. And yet there it was. That night, I lay awake, not restless, just aware. I could hear the murmur of their conversation upstairs. Soft music. Laughter. They did not come down. They rarely did anymore. And I no longer waited for it. Instead, I opened the drawer beside my bed, took out the list, unfolded it. I added one more line at the bottom. To leave without needing anyone to understand why. I folded it again, pressed it flat, and slipped it into my coat pocket, just in case. In the morning I would wake and go to see a house with yellow tiles and no stairs. And I would do it not because I had to, but because for the first time in years I could. I stayed by the window long after the light began to fade. The kitchen upstairs clicked and clattered. Cabinets opening. Drawers sliding. Silverware moving like the soundtrack of a life that had stopped including me. I did not go up. I did not expect an invitation. Instead, I watched the last band of gold settle on the ivy leaves outside. How many years had I spent making room for others, clearing space at tables and calendars, in conversations, so they could feel seen even when I was not? I thought about how many birthdays I had planned, not mine, but theirs. Wrapped presents in brown paper, baked cakes with whipped frosting cut into pieces, and always served myself last. No one told me to. But I had believed that love meant staying useful until I forgot what it meant to simply be loved. Now I was learning again. Learning that leaving is not the same as losing. That choosing differently is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the quietest way to stay whole. I stood, gathered my coat, laid it across the back of the chair like a promise to myself. Tomorrow, I would go see that little yellow kitchen. Not because it was perfect, but because it was mine to consider. And tonight, I would sleep not with hope, but with something steadier. A kind of steady that comes when you finally stop asking for permission to want peace. Sandy picked me up right on time. She had not changed much. Still drove the same silver sedan, still kept tissues in the glove box and mints in the center console. We did not speak much on the way. She let the radio play soft jazz like a hum in the background, not demanding, just there. The neighborhood was quiet. Modest homes, low fences, driveways, with chalk drawings and mailboxes that leaned slightly but still stood. The house sat at the end of a short street, yellow siding, white trim, a porch with 2 rocking chairs and a wind chime that sang without rushing. We stepped inside. The floor creaked, but not in protest. It felt like welcome. Like memory. Sandy walked ahead, opened each door, showed me the closet space, the pantry, the back gate. But I lagged behind, not because I doubted, but because I was listening. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator. The way sunlight fell across the linoleum. The shape of quiet that did not ask me to shrink. In the back room, there was a small built-in shelf. Empty, but lined with pale blue wallpaper printed with tiny leaves. I ran my hand along it, imagining my books, my teacups, my name still written somewhere without apology. Sandy leaned in the doorway. "You do not have to decide now." I nodded. But I already knew this was not about rushing. It was about recognizing a space where I would not be erased. We sat on the porch a while, watched a bird hop along the railing, then disappear into a bush. "I know it is not perfect," Sandy said. "It creaks. It leans. It will need new curtains." I smiled. "So do I." She laughed softly and looked at me, not like someone waiting for a sale, but like someone who had once seen me before the fading started. We rode back in quiet again, with soft jazz again, with no pressure. When I stepped out of the car, Sandy placed her hand on mine. "Whatever you choose, make sure it has a door that only you can open." I held that thought all the way down the driveway. And when I entered the house, the old house, the house that still bore my name, I did not sigh. I just stood there and knew the leaving had already begun. On Thursday, I walked into James Howell's office alone. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and quiet things. The kind of quiet that feels chosen, not forced. He greeted me with a small nod, no questions, just a folder and a pen that wrote smoothly without scratch. We reviewed everything. Title rights. Transfer options. Contingency clauses that let me choose the terms and the silence. I asked if it could be done discreetly. He nodded again. "There is dignity in paper," he said. "Especially when it has your name on it." We signed. Not everything, just enough. Enough to begin the clock without setting off alarms. Outside, the sky was clear, too blue for November. I walked home past a bakery, where the scent of cinnamon hung in the air like something waiting to be remembered. When I entered the house, no one noticed. Kelly was filming in the dining room. Ring lights glowing like moons that did not warm. Evan was upstairs. I could hear the shower running, the clink of his razor. I moved through the hallway, deliberate but quiet. Gathered the documents, placed them in the drawer next to the photo of my husband and the tin of buttons I never quite sorted. That night I baked. Not for them. For me. A small lemon cake, my mother's recipe, with zest and honey, and just enough butter to hold the edges golden. I lit a single candle and left the kitchen window cracked so the scent could rise into the rooms above. They never asked. But for the first time, I did not feel unseen. I felt unattached. Later I stood by the kitchen sink, hands warm from washing dishes, eyes resting on the back fence. And I whispered to the woman I had been, to the woman I was becoming. It is time, not to fight, not to beg, just to gather what is still yours. And carry it gently into some place new, where no one edits your name into a footnote. Where silence feels like peace, not punishment. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Plain envelope. No return address. But the seal, the way it was folded, I recognized James's hand. I waited until I was alone. Kelly had left for a yoga class. Evan was running errands, or said he was. I sat at the table, opened the flap slowly, carefully, as if it might bleed. Inside, one page. Clear. Direct. The transfer had been filed. The buyer had signed. 30 days to vacate per contract. My name was still there, but now beside the word seller. And beneath that a name I recognized. Sandy. The house, the yellow one with the porch, would be mine in just under a month. I folded the letter, pressed the crease, and breathed. It did not feel like victory. It felt like stillness. Like when a storm finally stops and you can hear the wind only as it moves away. That afternoon I walked the hallway slowly. My hands brushed the walls as if to tell them thank you and goodbye. In the living room, Kelly had left open boxes, half filled with candles, fabric swatches, an open notebook with podcast topics, scribbled in pink. I closed it gently. Then I walked to the shelf, the one where my books used to sit before the pastel quotes before the succulents. And I placed one book there. A poetry volume with my name on the inside cover, written in pen, shaky, but still mine. I did not say anything at dinner. They spoke about scheduling groceries, something about flights next month. I nodded when needed, but mostly I memorized. Memorized the shape of this before it changed. That night I set aside the recipe book, the list, the brochure. I placed them all in a small box wrapped in cloth, tied in ribbon. Not because it was a gift, but because I had decided to give myself back to myself. And when I turned out the light, there was no ache, only quiet. The kind I had chosen. The next morning I made waffles. Not the frozen kind. Real batter. Vanilla. A hint of cinnamon. The kind Evan used to love before frozen meals and busy mornings took their place. I set 3 plates out of habit, not hope. They did not come, so I ate alone. Slowly. With butter. And syrup. I washed the dishes, dried them, put everything away. Then I took the envelope, the official one, and placed it on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl where no one could miss it. It sat there all day. Untouched. But not unseen. By evening, the silence had thickened. Evan came home first. Dropped his keys, opened the fridge, called up the stairs, but did not notice the envelope, not yet. Kelly came in louder. Arms full of shopping bags. Voice trailing from one room to the next until, "What's this?" I stayed in my room. Did not move. Listened. Footsteps. A pause. Another voice. "Babe. Did you see this? Is this real?" The fridge door closed. A cabinet opened. Closed again. Then his voice lower now. "She sold it. She actually." Kelly cut in. "But she can't, not without telling us. Not without." Silence. Then footsteps up the stairs toward my door. I did not open it. I did not have to. A knock. Then another. "Mom," his voice sounded smaller, less certain. I waited. Counted to 10. "I don't understand," he said. "There must be a mistake." I opened the door only halfway. "It's not a mistake," I said evenly. He stared at me like I had spoken in a language he never learned. "I thought we were family," he whispered. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man I raised who no longer saw me except when it was convenient. "We were," I said. "And maybe we still are. But families don't erase each other quietly and expect nothing in return." He stepped back. Said nothing. I closed the door, not with anger, but with care. Because some doors are meant to stay shut once you've finally learned how to walk through them. I did not leave right away. I gave it a week. Time for them to process, to read, to pace the floors. I once mopped, to look at rooms they never noticed until they realized they were no longer theirs. Evan stopped speaking. Mostly stayed in the garage. Kelly grew sharper. Drawers slammed harder. The house felt like a question, with no answer. But I kept moving. Each morning I packed a little. Books. Frames. My teacups. Wrapped in linen towels, the ones I had brought from the old house, the house I sold to save them. Now I was saving myself. On the last night, I stood in the kitchen long after they had gone upstairs. I ran my hand along the counter, felt the cool edge of the sink, the familiar hum of the old fridge. This kitchen had held so many quiet sacrifices. Too many. I wrote a note. Not bitter. Just honest. I cooked. I stayed. I forgave quietly. But this time I am choosing myself. With no noise. With no need for permission. I folded it, placed it under the salt jar, the one they never moved because they never used it. In the morning, I left the keys on the table. Took the last box in my arms and stepped outside. The sky was soft. A little gray. The kind of light that does not ask for attention but lingers. Sandy waved from her car. I opened the door, sat down, and did not look back. Not once. As we turned the corner, I saw a child on a tricycle laughing, feet too small to reach the pedals. That laughter stayed with me all the way to the yellow house. The door was already open. The curtains already drawn. Inside, the air smelled like new paint and lemon soap. I placed the box on the counter. Unwrapped the first teacup. Set it in the cupboard. Then another. And another. By the time the shelf was full, the room felt different. Not just new. Mine. I stood at the window. Watched the wind move through the trees. And for the first time in years, I did not wonder if someone would come find me. Because this time I was not missing. I was home. The mornings came slower in the yellow house. Not quiet but soft. The kind of quiet that let you hear yourself without echo. I rose early, not because I had to but because I could. The kitchen welcomed me with its crooked tile, its curtain that danced even when there was no wind. I made tea the way I used to, with a small dish for the spoon and a cloth napkin folded in thirds. No one interrupted. No one rushed. It was strange at first to not apologize for the space I took up. To let the chair scrape the floor without flinching. To hum a tune without fear it would clash with someone else's mood. The bookshelf filled slowly. Not with bestsellers but with memory. The photo of me and my husband went on the mantle. The one where we are laughing, just off center, not posed. I placed a vase beside it. Not for flowers. For letters. Little ones I wrote to myself. Notes that began with, "You are not invisible," or, "She remembered who she was," and rested there. Some afternoons I baked. Sometimes just for the smell. Lemon bread. Molasses cookies. Things that made the house feel lived in, not borrowed. Neighbors came slowly. A knock here. A wave through the fence. A pie left by the door with no name attached. I did not rush to answer. Healing, it turns out, does not like to be scheduled. One morning, I opened the back door and stepped barefoot onto the porch. The wood was warm, the air sweet with that in-between scent of cut grass and coming rain. And I thought, maybe this is the legacy they never taught us to want. Not the heirlooms. Not the money. But peace. A quiet that is earned, not inherited. I do not know what Evan told his friends. Or what Kelly posted online. That part no longer belongs to me. What I do know is that the silence between us is no longer sharp. It is just distance. And distance can be soft when you choose it. I still keep the list, the one that started everything. It is folded inside the recipe book, yellowed now, edges frayed. But every word still true. What I want. What I claimed. What I kept when the house was no longer mine, but I finally was. I planted time beneath the window. Not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of things that last without asking for attention. Each morning I checked the soil, noticing how roots take their time, how growth is quiet and always begins underground. Inside, the house grew too. Not bigger, but deeper. The chair by the window wore a new cushion. The rug in the hallway softened with steps. The teacups found their rhythm again, clinking in solitude without sounding alone. Sometimes I thought of Evan. Not with anger. Not even sadness. Just a slow ache, like when a song ends before the final note resolves. I left a letter for him once. Not sent. Just written. I told him I forgave him long before the papers came. But I also said some things once given away too often do not return the same. Respect. Time. A mother's listening. Kelly never reached out. Perhaps it was easier that way. There are silences we choose. And silences we grow into. I no longer tried to break either. Instead, I made jam. I hosted a book club. I started writing again, just a little on the back of grocery lists in the margins of magazines. Words found me not because I chased them, but because when the world stopped drowning me out, I remembered how to hear myself. One evening, a neighbor's granddaughter stopped by. She held a music assignment, a school report on Appalachian folk songs. We sat at the table, two women years apart, but both listening. And when she left, she turned to me and said, "You talk like a poem." I smiled. Maybe I do. Maybe that's what happens when you spend your life being rewritten and finally decide to write the ending yourself. The late light pressed against the kitchen wall and everything inside felt still and clean. No war had been fought. No door slammed. And yet I had reclaimed something that once felt lost forever. My name. My voice. My center. I poured myself tea. No sugar this time. Just warmth. I placed one last letter in the drawer, signed it clearly. To no one, and to myself. You were never a burden. You were simply too quiet in a house that stopped listening. Not anymore. The wooden porch holds the late afternoon sun. A breeze stirs the thyme. And in the stillness, a name remains, not as a warning, but as a welcome. What kind of peace would you build if no one interrupted? We'd love to read your story in the comments below. You are not alone. Your journey matters. Subscribe to Grandma Radio, where every story is a second chance.